Hello everyone and welcome to the Myths of King Arthur panel here at the Digital Tabletop Fest with Steam. My name's Hannah Corcoran, I'm a junior producer at Auroch Digital and I'm thrilled today to be joined by these lovely people on the panel, ready to discuss the myths and legends of King Arthur. Perhaps you'd all like to take a moment to introduce yourselves.
Hi, thanks, Hannah. I'm Dr Victoria Shirley. I hold a PhD in medieval literature from Cardiff University, and in particular focusing on sort of the Arthurian legend as it sort of developed in Britain. And also I'm a member of the International Authurian Society, which kind of promotes the academic study of King Arthur.
That's really cool. And David?
Hi, I'm David Larkins. I'm the line editor for the Pendragon tabletop role-playing game, published by Chaosium Incorporated.
Lovely to meet you. And Krzysztof?
Yes, Krzysztof, I'm the lead writer at Awaken Realms, a board gaming company known for games such as Nemesis, FL Fields, Tainted Grail, This War of Mine, the board game, and others. And we do now branch into digital games with digital versions of Tainted Grail, The Fall of Avalon, and digital version of Nemesis.
Hi, I'm Jon Ingold. I'm the narrative director at Inkle. We're an independent game developer making narrative games. We've made a pretty broad range of genres and playstyles over the last 10 years, but last year we made a game called Pendragon, which was obviously a King Arthur game. It was kind of a chess-like tactics game, but the idea was that the characters talk depending on the moves that you make during the game, and that kind of builds a story out of those fragments. And it was particularly about the death of Arthur and the fall of Mordred. That was the focus of it.
Hey everyone, my name is Gergely Vas and I work at Newcore Games and in the studio from Budapest, Hungary. And we also made a bunch of games and currently working on King Arthur Knight's Tale, which is available in early access on Steam. And it's a turn-based tactical game with role-playing elements and roguelite elements. And of course, it is based on the Arthurian myth. And the full version is out very soon on Steam.
Really cool. So I'm very excited to talk to you all today. Dr. Shirley, I'm wondering if you could kick us off with a brief overview of King Arthur from the perspective of your work in medieval literature.
Yeah, of course. So King Arthur is really originally a Welsh legend. Sort of Arthur emerges in sort of Welsh historical texts written in Latin, and he emerges as a sort of military leader, first of all. And we see him sort of as a war hero who defends Britain against the Saxon invasions. And there's two very famous texts, the Historia Brittonum and the Welsh Annals. And the Welsh Annals in particular is the first reference to the Battle of Camlan, where Arthur, of course, fights Mordred and dies. There are a few other references to Arthur in medieval sort of Welsh poetry, just sort of brief allusions, but perhaps the first sort of full developed text as we know it about sort of King Arthur is again another Welsh tale, sort of called the English title would be How Killoch Won Olwen. And in this text, sort of we see Arthur's nephew Killoch come to Arthur's court to ask for his help, and in winning a bride, Olwen, and Olwen is the daughter of a giant, Isbaddaden, and sort of although Killoch is, coming to request Arthur's aid at his court, Arthur really becomes like the central figure in helping his nephew achieve a bride and really overcome all these sort of impossible challenges that the giant Isbaddaden sets for him. So that's sort of the Welsh origins of Arthur. And some people might tell you that Arthur is an English legend, but actually it derives from Wales first of all, and then it sort of transitions more to England, and in particular we see in the 12th century the writing of Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain, which is a text I've worked on in particular. And in this text we sort of see Arthur, for the first time Arthur has a biography, sort of a legendary story of Arthur's life, but actually sort of although this is actually quite a long text that covers the sort of the foundation of Britain by Brutus, a grandson of Aeneas, the Trojan Aeneas. it covers down to the fall of Britain in the 6th century with Cadwallader, the last king of the Britons. Arthur is really sort of the central figure in this text, and the Authurian story covers sort of about a third of the book in total. And we see Arthur again as partly a war hero, but also a monarch, a king. This is the first King Arthur, and he conquers or sort of defends Britain against the Saxons, but also conquers much of Europe, including France, Ireland, well, which is part of Britain, of course, but also Norway, and like his empire sort of reaches across Europe. But also crucially, his empire falls, and he loses, and he has the tragic sort of Battle of Camlan where he fights Mordred. So that's really a centerpiece. I think Geoffrey of Monmouth, a really centerpiece of the Arthurian legend, which triggers again another kind of writing of Arthur. And we move into France this time with the work of a French writer called Chrétien de Troyes. Chrétien sort of takes inspiration from Geoffrey in thinking about sort of the mythical legend of Arthur, but he focuses more on individual knights. So where Arthur was sort of the hero and the focus of other stories, Chrétien focuses on individual knights, like Lancelot, for instance, and of course, the affair of Lancelot and Guinevere emerges in Chrétien's work. But Chrétien also writes about other knights, in particular Percival, and the story of the Grail. Just to briefly then sort of move on to another stage, but coming towards, I suppose, the end of the Middle Ages, the late Middle Ages, we have sort of very French romance cycles, which expand the legend even further, from Arthur's, the birth of Arthur's kingdom to the fall, and the fall of Camelot. But within this narrative, we also have stories of the Grail quest, of stories of individual knights, and crucially the fall of Camelot. We have some really long texts, but these French texts are sort of translated and summarized finally by a writer called Sir Thomas Malory in the late 15th century. And Malory writes this sort of compendium of stories of the Knights of the Round Table. I think Malory might be probably the most familiar medieval writer, and sort of most probably, along with Geoffrey, one of the most influential writers on later versions of the legend. So Malory is a great sort of starting point, I think, for anyone who's interested in the sort of the medieval texts. That's a summary from me then.
Great. Thank you. So the legend of King Arthur has been around for quite some time then. Why does this panel think it is that creators keep returning to this story time and time again?
So follow up from what I was saying then. I think partly sort of Arthur, the legend of Arthur, is about sort of power and the use and exercise of power in the real world. In particular, sort of we're thinking about the beginnings of Arthur's kingdom, so the rise, of a powerful king. Also, we've got a diversity of stories of individual knights and heroes, a whole sort of cast of characters, if you like. But of course, one of the essential elements of Arthur's story is about its destruction and the fall of Camelot. And there we see sort of the loss of power, the loss of Arthur's kingdom, and really sort of all those competing loyalties that sort of caused the fall of Camelot, I think.
I think for me, it's that fall of Camelot that makes it really compelling. That you could very loosely describe Arthur as a superhero, right? In various texts, he goes around fighting giants, and I think in Malory he defeats the Pope or something like that. But that's really missing the point entirely to look at it that way. Instead, he's this central figure who we attribute him with wisdom and with kindness and with compassion and with this sense of something that he can really build that will make the world a better place with the people around him. And that cast changes from telling to telling, but there's always that idea that he's building something that it can't hold, that it's too good for this world, and that it ends up being destroyed. And that sense of being something that's fragile, or something that ought to be good enough to survive in the world but can't survive in the world, is so wonderfully tragic that it wants to be retold each time, because you want to bring this thing back to life, and you want to go back through it again and see this thing rise again and fall again. And that, for me, I think, is what makes it what makes it a worthwhile story, that it's not, you don't have to just keep one-upping it every time you do it. If I retell Arthur, it doesn't have to be bigger and more bombastic than the last time it was told, because it has its own destruction in it. So every telling is good, and that's I love that about it. I think that's really wonderful.
Yes, I think what's essential for me in Authurian legend is, and probably the reason why it resonates with people so much throughout the centuries, is that it's essentially a story of our struggle against chaos. It's a story about how we can build those beautiful things, how we can build those perfect brotherhoods, how we can strive to something great. But we will never defeat chaos. We will never defeat entropy. It's always hidden somewhere, and at some point it will return, because nothing lasts forever, regardless of how perfect it is.
It's as if the tale itself is a phoenix that keeps rising from its own ashes, the retellings and things.
I would also add that because of the large cast of characters from the cycles, there's just so many different individual stories you can focus on, and the different characters who represent different sort of iconic or mythological archetypes. Everyone had, anyone who gets into Arthurian legend develops their favorites. Some people love Gawain, some people love Lancelot, some people think Guinevere's horrible, other people are sympathetic towards Guinevere, et cetera, et cetera. So and when you retell the stories, you can choose to focus in different ways. The recent Green Knight movie is a great example of that, how you can turn things around in an established story and use it to tell your own story.
And that sort of helps keep this medieval tale relevant within the 21st century still. Do you have anything to add, Gergely?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I completely agree. And it's almost impossible to ignore or not to copy certain elements if you'd like to make a game about knights and wizards, because it's such a standard knightly tale.
Krzysztof, could you tell us perhaps about the Fallen Grail version of the Myths of King Arthur?
Right, so our version is not a straight-up retelling, it's more of an elaborate what-if scenario. So we start off with a early medieval realm, early medieval fantasy realm, and we have King Arthur, we have the Roundtable, everything that happened in most common retellings of the legend does happen, but then the plague comes. The plague is called Red Death, and it is loosely based obviously on the Black Death from our real history. And Red Death almost annihilates Arthur's kingdom. But Arthur has a plan. He knows of a place, an island on the border of our reality and a different one, and he decides to set sail for this island, for Avalon, with the rest of his people and the rest of his knights. They land on Avalon. It's a very inhospitable place because it was never meant for humans. They conquer Avalon because, Arthur is a conqueror at his core. And the games actually kick off, our 3 story campaigns actually kick off 600 years later. When Avalon is already conquered, the humanity struggles to survive on this island. King Arthur is a legend. The Round Table is still around, but that's only because the names of the Knights of the Round Table became titles, honorary titles that are bestowed from generation to generation. And what players actually do is they need to rediscover what happened during the conquest, what Arthur and his knights did, what powers did they had to destroy, what powers did they had to basically barter with, and solving the situation in their timeline requires them to basically reconstruct the entire history of the conquest of Avalon by Arthur and his knights. That's the essential part of basically all story campaigns that we use in Tainted Grail, The Fall of Avalon board game, and it is also the main theme of our 2 digital games.
Sort of for a new way to go back and retell the tale by having the characters rediscover everything for themselves.
characters begin as blank slates. They do know the parts of Arthurian legend that we all know, but there was a new part written when Arthur conquered Avalon, and this is something we have to rediscover for ourselves.
Really cool, thank you. David, could you tell us anything about the Pendragon RPG and why Chaosium, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, Chaosium, decided to set up a tabletop game in this setting?
Yeah, of course. So the Pendragon RPG is, as the name implies, is wholly focused on playing role-playing games in the world of King Arthur, Pendragon, and his knights. And it was originally published back in the 80s. It's been in print ever since. It was the creation of Greg Stafford, who founded Chaosium and also created the world of Glorantha, game RuneQuest. But really, Pendragon was his personal expression, his sort of magnum opus, I guess you could say. He loved the myths of King Arthur, grew up reading the Prince Valiant comics and Mallory and other Arthurian literature. And so he wanted to create a game that would emulate those stories. So you have mechanics in the game that push the characters to do things oftentimes against their better interests, their hatreds or their loves, their valor, their recklessness will compel them to push forward in the face of sometimes common sense, but other times doing what is right, even though it might cost them dearly, so it generates these very epic stories. I've been playing Pendragon regularly for over 15 years, and it's produced some of the most memorable gaming experiences I've ever had. Greg sadly passed away in 2018, and shortly before he did, he had given me the supreme honor of carrying on the game line, and we're doing our best with that. We're going to be publishing the 6th edition of the game next year, which he was working on at the time of his death. So it's still a living game, and we're proud to carry it on in his name.
Jon, Ingold's known for story-based games as well. Of all the stories that you could have taken on, why did you decide on King Arthur?
So it was kind of it was a coming together of things. Like we've worked on a lot of games in a lot of different genres and styles and narrative genres and play styles over the kind of 10 years that Ingold has been running. Pendragon actually started with a board game. We were just building an abstract board game, just you move counters around and there were various rules. It was sort of chess-like and sort of not. And we iterated on this thing and we got to a design we liked, and then we thought, well, okay, if we want to turn this into an Ingold game, if we want to turn this into a game that fits within the stuff that we do, it needs some kind of narrative. But we didn't really feel very inspired about a narrative that was about one group of people trying to clonk another group of people. We couldn't really think of anything that worked for that. And then I live in the UK, and then Brexit happened. And meanwhile, in the US, Trump was happening and Black Lives Matter was happening. And there was just this sense that there was a wave of smug, self-satisfied, violent idiocy rising in the world. And that reminded me of something. And it reminded me of a book that I really loved when I was 10, 11, which is called The Once and Future King by T.H. White, which is a retelling of Arthur done in the 30s that I don't know if this is the proper reading of it, but for me anyway, is him talking about the rise of fascism through the lens of Arthur. So you have this sense of a world that could be intelligent and kind and compassionate being destroyed by people who are liars. But everyone in the story is a liar. Arthur is a liar. He knows about Guinevere and Lancelot. Lancelot's a liar. Guinevere's a liar. Mordred is a liar, but Mordred is different because he knows he's a liar and he's not ashamed of it. Everyone else is trying to be better, but Mordred says, no, this is how bad I actually am. And that's exactly how Mr. Johnson runs the UK right now, and that's exactly how Mr. Trump ran the US. It was the difference between the good and the bad right now is that we have the politicians who try not to lie or feel bad when they do, and the politicians who just lie gloriously. And that kind of lit a fire underneath me that I thought, oh, okay, now I can see that this is what I want to be writing about right now. This is what feels like it matters. But I don't actually want to write a game about modern UK politics because I don't really want to trivialize it. And anyway, I don't know enough. So that came together for me that Arthur was the right metaphor talk about what I wanted to talk about, which is, when the world is gone mad and when things are being done that make no sense at all and they're super destructive, what do you do? And the only thing you can do is try to be kind of honorable and noble and push forward all the time. And so Pendragon is a game about Camlan. It's about the final battle of Camlan, where Arthur is going to die, and he's going to die, and he doesn't stand a chance. Actually, in the game, you can save him, but that's kind of irrelevant, actually. And it's really about trying to bring as many people to his side as possible. And that really fitted with the game that we'd designed, because it's a game where every piece is a character. You kind of build them up, and they develop stories as they play, and things happen to them, and they change. And those are real, meaningful abilities within the game. But anyone can die at any time. And in fact, people have to die. To win at the game, you have to throw people to the wolves. You have to sacrifice people. It works a bit like chess. You can't win chess and protect your pieces. Those two things are incompatible. And in a game of Pendragon, you have to be willing to develop Guinevere across the board and then put her in harm's way immediately and watch her get killed. And that's how you play. And then someone else will pick up the mantle, and one of your other characters will carry on this kind of journey, and they'll remember Guinevere, or they'll remember Lancelot, or whoever that character was. And that felt right to me, that it's this sense that that the business, when everything is going wrong, the idea of what's good and right and proper is the only thing which can survive. The people can't, but the ideas can. And I think that goes right back to why Arthur is still such a popular story, is that it's a story about how the Round Table gets destroyed, but it's okay because the idea of the Round Table survives brilliantly, actually. And I don't know, I always say that when they were founding Parliament in the UK in the Middle Ages, or the late Middle Ages, the people doing that weren't explicitly making a round table, but they all knew the story of the Round Table. They would have had that in their heads. And that's kind of cool, that idea that this idealized thing can survive when your individual pieces on your game board can't. So that kind of drew me to it. And I've always wanted to write something about Arthur. And then it was just a question of finding the right take on it. And we wanted to reclaim a bit of the Welshness as well. So I read T.H. White, and I read The Idylls of the King, which is Alfred Lord Tennyson's epic poem, which is full of wonderful language. But I also read a lot of the Mabinogion, and we pulled a lot of the names for our characters and our place names and things from the Welsh texts to try and give it a bit more of that Dark Age, British, slightly weird flavor. David was talking about how everyone has a favorite Arthurian character, and mine is, of course, Merlin. Like, I don't care about any of the knights, actually. I like Merlin. I like Merlin stories. When I was a kid, I wanted to find out who the heck is this Merlin guy. And I love that it has that X Factor character built right into it, like, who doesn't operate by the rules that everyone else operates by. So we tried to pull it that way a little bit, but it was really fun bringing all those different things together. So I guess ultimately it was just a really, really rich body of legends to work with for a story-based game. Like, I'm not sure I'd want to write another Arthurian game. I think I'd like to go somewhere else now. But definitely as a writer and as a game designer, it was a really, really interesting project to pull all those things together. And then to be able to say, yes, and it's about fascism, just makes me feel good,
You mentioned Merlin being your favourite characters. What is everyone's sort of favourite character from the Arthur Tales?
Mine is
And for me, it's
sorry. Yeah, mine is Mordred, because in our game, your main character is Mordred, actually, because our take is a little bit different. So yeah, that's why.
And for me, it's Percival. Particularly the versions where he, finds the Grail. He's just such an interesting character. I think he's very relatable in being this sort of naive idiot, at first, who just has to kind of stumble his way through, these arcane courtly rules. He kind of contrasts against, the structures that are in place, just through his almost instinctual knighthood. It's such an interesting and compelling narrative, and he's just a fun character.
What about you, Krzysztof?
Yeah,
Vicky?
I was probably going with Percival as well. Percival and the Grail quest. That's a thing that resonates, I think, with me. And how the Grail quest slowly changes Percival, and how we have to be careful so that even if we go towards this holy goal, that the goal doesn't actually change us too much or consumes us.
Yeah, and my one would be probably Bedivere. I don't know. It's not as popular as probably Percival, Gawain, or Merlin. I mean, also Mordred. what's that about? Oh yeah, mine would be Bedivere, and Bedivere is more famously at Arthur's side when he dies, the tragic death of King Arthur. And Bedivere is instructed sort of 3 times by Arthur to throw sort of Excalibur into the lake, and obviously he sort of refuses because he can't let go of, I suppose, the ideals that Arthur represents. And I think Bedivere also just sort of stands for sort of loyalty, absolute loyalty for to his king. Yeah.
Probably another reason why these tales have endured for so long is just this array of characters within them, all with different traits that different people can sort of empathise with and respond to. Really cool. Which you'll hear me say a lot in this session. It just is. So Gergely, King Arthur and the Knight's Tale has a different take on the King Arthur story. You sort of went into it a little bit when saying about your favourite character, but could you tell us a bit more about how you approached it?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, it's a different take indeed. So in King Arthur Knight's Tale, the story begins where most of the Arthurian tales end, after the Battle of Camlan, which was, of course, the final skirmish between King Arthur and his nemesis Sir Mordred. And so there are several versions to this legend, but we, as a main idea behind the game, we wanted to ask the question, what happened after the Battle of Camlan? What could happen? And what would happen if the Lady of the Lake's grand plan didn't work as intended? So in our story, the once and future king has been stuck somewhere between alive and dead, and becoming something that could not be healed and cannot die. So yeah, it's a kind of different take, and we imagine the character who's in endless pain, slowly going insane, and a king with otherworldly powers trapped on an island that is shaped by magic, and which he will slowly begin to turn into his nightmare in the game. And so yeah, this is where the Lady of the Lake enters the stage again, and she has become this powerless creature in her own domain, and she's watching helplessly as the king destroys everything here. And she needs someone who could stop King Arthur before Avalon succumbs to his fevered dreams. And yeah, she decides that this someone will be Mordred, because the only option sometimes is far from the most ideal solution. And with great concern, she decides to bring back Mordred from the dead. So yeah, after all, Sir Mordred almost finished the job once, so who could be a better candidate to do it again? So yeah, this is where our game begins. You're in Camelot with a confused Mordred, looking for answers, and looking for companions, and yeah, this is it.
Sort of to explore the story through a completely different lens.
Yeah. So right now, as we are in early access, you can access Act 1 of the story campaign, playable with Mordred and a whole bunch of characters. Of course, all the knights, all the heroes, all the characters appear in one way or another in this nightmarish fever dream of Avalon, and there will be more acts, and slowly you're gonna find out what happened.
It's a very interesting way of looking at the tale, for sure. Yeah. Why does it that everyone thinks that role-playing games, sort of in particular, of all sort of genres of games, find so much common ground with the stories of King Arthur?
I think we already talked about this. It's just the scope, the number of characters, the number of stories. It's very hard to tell a story involving knights, wizards, and the courts that wasn't somehow, touched on or used in this retelling of Arthurian legend or the other.
I mean,
Yeah,
I
and
really.
Sorry.
I just was going to say I really love the way that like there are so many tellings of Arthur now, and they go in such different directions and they cover such scope that like if you're flicking through Mallory's work, there's 30 or 40 little episodic quests and little storylines that come through, and there's the romantic stuff, and there's the stuff about how Arthur was conceived, and then there's the kind of weird dolorous spears that have curses on them and all this sort of thing. It's really inventive stuff actually. And it feels sometimes the language can be quite hard if you're actually trying to read it to make sense of it, but the stories feel not modern because they have their own way of resolving, and they often go quite strange directions, but the kind of concepts that come up feel very familiar for when you're looking around at general sort of fantasy and gaming fantasy as well. But I guess that really goes the other way around, and it's just because all of the people making these games have gone back to the Arthurian legends to think, oh, we'll nick that idea and bung it in our game. So a lot of it feels it's so old and it's so baked into so much of culture, especially the kind of culture of Britain. It's kind of seeped a bit everywhere, so it's very hard to find things that haven't been touched by it somehow. Yeah.
And I like to say that one of the reasons, one of the themes we've been talking about here is why these legends endure, and it's because you can retell them. Obviously, just everyone talking about their different games, we see like so many different iterations, some of which are closer to the the canon, and some of which take these really imaginative takes on it, which is amazing and great. And I think anytime somebody sits down to play an Arthurian role-playing game, tabletop or computer, you're kind of participating in that millennial old tradition, right? Where you're also helping to retell your version of the legends. With the Pendragon RPG, there's the Great Pendragon Campaign, which was Greg Stafford's kind of melding all the different narrative traditions into like this big 80-year long chronology, and you can play the whole thing. You can start out in the time of King Uther and go all the way to Camlan, and you'll actually be playing multiple generations of your family line. You'll get this household established. You'll have generational rivalries, romances, all that kind of stuff. And by the time you're done, you and your group have your version of the Arthurian legends as told through your knights, the eyes of your own knights, and then you can do it again and it'll be different the next time, and I think, yeah, it's that personalized element that is really compelling for folks.
Yeah, it's a blessing for games really, because it's a myth with many branches and stories, almost like this modular thing where you can pick the right characters or mini stories, and you can just use them. And it's also widely known enough, it's old enough, so you can play with the well-known elements from the Arthurian lore, and you can create an inherently fantasy world based on some historical facts and a whole lot of mythology.
Sure, sort of your opinion, Vicky, coming from a non-sort of games background.
Yeah, I am not. I can't sort of have to plead my ignorance a little bit with RPGs. But yeah, I think picking up on a couple of the sort of ideas there. I think there's a diversity of characters. Like you can have up to like what Mallory listed about probably close to 200 knights. While some are minor, and others more well developed, there's a whole cast of characters for, in some ways, for also people to develop themselves. Because medieval literature doesn't always have a sort of sense of character. It's driven, I suppose, by certain ideals and values, and those, of course, translate also to this idea, I suppose, of a lot of ideas about sort of fellowship and brotherhood, I suppose, that really is unique to the Round Table. But I suppose players can delight in sort of crafting their own version of these characters, based in the legends, but also a sort of modern update as well. And it's it can be intensely personal, the legend, but also universal at the same time. So that's a brief summary of my thoughts there. Yeah.
We briefly mentioned earlier about how it's sort of so saturated into British culture, and particularly this tale of King Arthur. What about how any other tales around the Round Table that we see in other types of fantasy lore, like in Lord of the Rings and Dungeons and Dragons? Any sort of thoughts on?
I mean, I always thought of Lord of the Rings as much something else, something quite a lot weirder. I think it comes more from the Norse sagas, and I mean they're all about heroes and adventurers and people defeating things that should be defeated, I suppose. But Vicky was saying that Arthur comes with this sense of brotherhood and fellowship and this idea of a round table, and that's interesting because obviously the Lord of the Rings has the Fellowship and the Ring in it, and I think it's not a round table. I think it's quite a different kind of brotherhood. Then I don't know. I mean, it has a betrayer in it. It has that sense of kind of they go on this grand thing and it all falls apart. Like, is that Arthurian, or is that just like a common human story that we just keep telling in all different cultures because it keeps bloody happening? I don't know. Yeah, like I think one thing I really notice in British culture and like fantasy culture though is something really specific and ridiculous, but I think it's really notable, is swords. Like British children are obsessed with swords. They find swords really exciting. And I only raise it because I mentioned it once in a talk when I was trying to think about how weird that is, actually, that when British people look at America, we often think that the way that Americans talk about guns is very difficult for British people to understand because it just seems very alien. And people say, well, why would you want to walk around with this thing that kills people in your pocket? That's really strange. But then as soon as you say to a British person, would you like to carry a sword? They go, oh, yes, brilliant, swords, love them, which is, of course, just another thing for killing people. It just comes from a different mythological context because us British people, we don't think we're cowboys. We think we're knights of the Round Table. And I do feel like that is quite a driver behind almost all fantasy fiction that gets made, is like, actually, it's just this fantasy of having a sword. I'd love to have a sword. It looks really fun, but I can't really back that up with anything, and I certainly shouldn't ever be allowed a sword. But like, yeah, I don't know, I see that coming up everywhere, like even in sort of, I recently read a sci-fi novel that's done quite well called Gideon the Ninth, and it is just a book about someone with a sword. Like that's its primary driver, and it just seems to be why everybody loves it. I don't know.
Yes, I think there is a historical context here as well. I'm not a specialist on history of fantasy fiction, but there was this renewed interest in Arthurian legend in 19th century. In 19th century, late 19th century, and that's when the fantasy lore as we know it also began to emerge. So I think it's also a historical process.
Yeah, and regarding D&D, I think and also other high fantasy RPGs, I think there are always like a region or a part of a setting where you could find an exact copy or like a similar region that's somehow similar to the Arthurian myth or the Arthurian legend. So there's always this part of any setting where you could play something similar to the Arthurian myth.
I suppose, from my point of view, I suppose the Arthurian story, in being sort of medieval, and being set in like the 6th century, but obviously the sort of the legends emerge throughout the ages. There's a sense of historical distance as well. and this sense of, I suppose, strangeness or maybe otherness about the period that is perhaps inherently interesting, inherently attractive. And I think that's like partly also plays into sort of fantasy as well, a sense of otherworldliness of, you know, transcending this world. And it's also interesting to note, I think, that there are there are influential writers within the Authurian legend, but also really influential fantasy writers that have also sort of strange connections to the Authurian legend as well, and vice versa. So someone like Tolkien was a medievalist. He was primarily interested in Old English and Norse legends, and that's partly the sort of the Lord of the Rings is driven by a sense for an English mythology, and Tolkien wasn't entirely comfortable with the Arthurian story because it was seen as British. But he is intensely interested, of course, in this, that bond of fellowship, and what it means to, I suppose, sustain those relationships, and how those relationships develop over time and throughout the Lord of the Rings as well. And actually, Tolkien, he did write, although unfinished. It's an unfinished poem, The Fall of Arthur. So he did actually write an Arthurian sort of epic, really. But he I suppose couldn't finish it for some reason or another. And it's about ultimately, the fall of Arthur. It's about Arthur's final battle with Mordred as well. So I think it's perhaps a sense of otherworldliness, or a sense of perhaps also a desire to return to those values. Is really sort of perhaps what drives an interest in some of these stories.
Tolkien also did the translation of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight.
Yes, yeah.
And I think in terms of his influence on D&D, and then Arthurian Tales' influence on D&D, I mean, my hot take is that to the extent that D&D has any medieval trappings at all, it comes through those sources. D&D is not actually a medieval setting in any way, shape, or form. It has these trappings, kind of Ren Fair trappings, that people resonate with. And I think that all comes, it's this idea that you would even play a knight in Dungeons and Dragons, comes through the Arthurian stories and Middle Earth as well. So, there's an undeniable presence there and legacy for sure.
One story that I've heard mentioned quite a lot during this panel is that of King Arthur's sort of downfall and his death towards the end in that final battle. But you mentioned, Jon, that in your game players have the option of keeping him alive. Why was that a decision? Why did you pop that in there?
So the original idea of the game was you're trying to bring people to support Arthur in his final battle, and what we kind of try to orchestrate is that by the time you get there, so you start the very last level with just Arthur, and then everyone that you manage to get through the rest of the game turns up a few moves later. And the way the game is designed, whichever piece you put on the board first tends to get killed first because it's in the front line. It's a bit like chess. When you move your pawns forward, that's what gets killed. So the idea was that the game mechanics would basically afford throwing Arthur to his death and then having these other people come up and mop up afterwards. So Arthur would always die, and then someone would be there to say, oh, we got here just too late. And in 95% of the run-throughs of the game, that does happen. But games being games, it's quite possible for Arthur to just wheedle his way through, have a final battle with Mordred, and then win. And so we kind of thought, well, we could try to say, well, you've managed to survive as Arthur, but that's not canon, so we're going to strike you with lightning or something. But that seemed a bit unreasonable. So we thought we might as well just build it into the narrative in a way. So depending on exactly which combination of characters you end the story with, it'll wrap it up with a little suitable piece of text. And I think the one, if you have Arthur, is that he decides to declare that he's died and disappear off to go and be sad somewhere and to tell this tale that he's died, which is a cop-out, but it's a reasonably clever one, I think. So we kind of get away with it. But Pendragon is built around this idea: if you play once, the first playthrough is quite short, and then you can replay it with more characters and more events and more stories, and it gets longer and more hard to play as you kind of loop through it. Because we're really interested in the retelling and the retelling and the retelling of the stories, rather than creating one perfect version.
Narrative.
Yeah, exactly. Or kind of replicating the existing narrative. It's more about the tone of it, I think. So when we came to it, we decided we kind of felt that Arthur actually dying wasn't necessarily that important, because by this point in our story, Camelot's dead. Almost everybody's dead. The ideal of Camelot is dead. Enough stuff has died that whether the actual old man Arthur survives or not doesn't break the narrative too completely, which was lucky because I was very worried about it for a long time. But yeah, no, it came up quite nicely in the end, I think.
What do you kind of think about if in those original tales he had survived instead of dying at the end? What kind of impact that would have left on the sort of flow of the whole tale?
I was always really struck by the way that when Mallory, Vicky mentioned Mallory, who brought all the kind of older legends together and made them palatable for a modern audience, really, though he wasn't doing that on purpose, but that is what he did. That he called the whole book The Death of Arthur, and 95% of it is not the death of Arthur, but the 5% at the end is. And he must have had this sense that the downfall is really, really important. Perhaps just because if Arthur doesn't die, he's kind of an obnoxious character that goes around winning everything, and that's not actually that likable. You kind of want him to fall at the end. So I think don't know. It's quite. Maybe it goes back to much older legends, actually, that I don't know. But it does feel to me really, really integral to the spirit of the thing that Arthur can't be allowed to win. He'd be just too good if he did.
Yeah, well, Arthur must. Yes, I say it's an integral part of the story. Arthur always must die, and there is this inherently sort of tragic ending to the whole legend. There is particularly, well, it's sort of particularly circled, we think, sort of within Welsh traditions, that there is this belief within Arthur, also this prophetic hope, shall we say, of Arthur, that he will return at the time of Britain's greatest need, and that Arthur is not truly dead. And sort of Arthur's death is, of course, rewritten multiple times throughout the tradition, and certain writers seem to sort of embrace this idea. I think Geoffrey Monmouth is sort of, he never perhaps he sort of leaves it open and ambiguous, perhaps, that Arthur would return, particularly drawing on sort of Welsh legends. Whereas someone like Mallory is more. I think Mallory is more final. He tries to sort of convince you that Arthur will not return. He's quite final in his description of Arthur's death, and that he has died and passed from this world. But yeah, there is a tradition, and it seems that some of these sort of games you're talking about, that they pick up on the idea, I suppose, of Arthur's afterlife, or Arthur's return, as we might call it. Return from the dead, almost. Which, as I say, is an integral part of the legend.
I think I really love about the Arthur will return thing is it's exactly what James Bond does at the end of every one of his movies. I love that.
It sounds like a game in its own right, just waiting to come out, doesn't it? Arthur returns.
And that's a theme even within the narrative itself, because of course Merlin is the first one to disappear, and Arthur, from that point on, is always waiting for him to come back. So it's a recurring theme even within the stories. So, in another 100 years or so, we were talking about how this tale is still modern, not still modern, still relevant in a modern setting like today. Do you think in 100 years or so whether the tale will still remain relevant to people?
Well, yes, I'd bet good money on this. I mean, if a story survived so many centuries and so many versions and so many retellings, it means, yes, as we've repeated this word several times, but yes, it means it resonates very deeply within us. There is, an element of natural selections to stories and myths. If something sticks for a very long time, it means it really speaks to us. And, so there is a pretty significant chance that this will be a part of a heritage of the entire humanity going forward, probably many centuries forward.
Yeah, I would agree. I think we've been talking a lot about how the stories are retold, but also sort of they're also reinvented to suit different sort of historical periods. You know, we within the high Middle Ages, the Authurian legends represent the ideals of chivalry, of crucially, the Knights of the Round Table, certain codes of behavior that people should exemplify. By the 19th century, in contrast, the legends become with someone like Tennyson, very sort of Christian legend. I mean, it was also with the Grail quest, but it's this very sort of Christian middle class legend, which also sort of is about governing codes of behavior. Sort of Tennyson's ideas about sort of gender are really interesting, but also very representative of his time, of the Victorian period. But it survives within the 20th century with sort of nationalist retellings, reinventions. So Arthur is ultimately really, while he is a symbol of power, his story is also about the idea of Britain and what Britain means, which I think is a very contentious issue historically, but also today with sort of Brexit and potential devolution or really independence, Scottish independence, for instance. So the UK itself is sort of fractured and perhaps fragmented in years to come, and what Arthur might look like might be a bit different. There's also something we haven't touched on. Also, there are feminist retellings of the legend as well. Marion Zimmer Bradley was perhaps one of the pioneers of those retellings in the 1980s. But really, I think, this legend can be retold and sort of reinvented, recoded for certain times, certain periods. I think it will inevitably endure, but it might look a bit different in 100 years' time. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree, because video games, for example, are a relatively new medium, and here we are, all of us creating video games in the Arthurian myth. So it's such a classic tale that I don't see why not. It's gonna be here with us forever.
I mean, I think if you're spitballing story ideas, you can always shove the word King Arthur into pretty much any genre and it makes sense. So you can say, oh, it's a cyberpunk King Arthur, and that makes instant sense. I don't know quite what it means, but you go, oh yeah, I can see that. And it has that quality of just, I think, because so much of what's at the core of it is actually, this is probably because it's been retold so many times already, but what's at the core of it is like a moral idea and a kind of idea, brotherhood and fairness and compassion, or betrayal and loss, or Merlin being weird and then disappearing, or whatever it is that you particularly like in the Arthurian story. But whether they're knights in armor on horseback or whether they're guys with swords in the Welsh forests actually kind of doesn't matter. So if you can make that change from the original Welsh tales to the kind of courtly romances of France, which is actually nothing to do with Welsh history at all, then it's not that big a leap to say, oh yeah, this is 1930s San Francisco and this guy is Sir Lancelot, which is what Raymond Chandler did with Philip Marlowe, pretty much, and to take it elsewhere. And yeah, so this thing is a chameleon. It can go anywhere it wants to, and that's great.
Just as we're wrapping things to a close in this panel discussion today, are there any texts in particular that you'd recommend for people who are just beginning to really get into the King Arthur myths that they should get out there and read?
I mean, John mentioned Once and Future King. I think that's really a great, like if you're going to read one book, check that one out. It's a great narrative. T.H. White, obviously, amazing author. And and then, there's so many translations of Mallory. There are versions that stick closer to the more archaic English, and then there are versions that modernize the language. So, if you want to really do a deep dive, like find a translation that has a rhythm to the language that works for you, and get into that, because that's just such an epic story.
Yeah, I'd probably recommend a retelling that's not only retelling, but stands on its own as an excellent story. And for example, for me, that would be the Avalon series by Marion Zimmer Bradley. That would be Bernard Cornwell's Warlord trilogy. There are many semi-Arthurian books and series that are simply a very good work of fiction, and that's, I think, what most people should start with, and only go into Thomas Malory after that when they already have some, vested interest in the Arthurian legend.
Yeah, I definitely support that. I read the T.H. White, The Once and Future King, when I was about 10, 11, and really adored it, and it's still one of my favorite books. And then I immediately picked up Mallory to try and read Mallory, and I hated it. I couldn't get my head around it at all. As an adult, I have read it, but as a kid, I was just, this is rubbish. So I think you do need a reason to want to read it, I think, whatever that reason might be. I also wanted to call out Mary Stewart's series, The Crystal Cave, and she wrote some novels after that. It's a retelling in that it's a cracking yarn, really well told by a very, very good storyteller. It's just a great read. I think it is a decent piece of fiction that's in that universe, so it's well worth reading. But it's not like a canonical text or anything particularly, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I do highly recommend Mallory as he presents this compendium of stories, and it's like it's a culmination of the Arthurian legend in the Middle Ages. But it again, it was the first thing I read, but that was on an English degree. But yeah, Mallory is great. Obviously, realize it's not a modern novel. It's quite different. But if you want something, I think that's almost like an introductory sort of compendium to the legends, then you might want to try something like actually Roger Lansing Green's Knights of the Round Table, which is probably not quite so well known, but it sort of pulls a lot of traditions together. But it's and he did the same thing for like a load of fantasy or like mythological works like Troy, Robin Hood, King Arthur, obviously, and it's just like a really accessible kind of like summary, I suppose, of some of the stories. Yeah, I mean, there's been loads of good recommendations here. I mean, I'm also going to throw out Geoffrey of Monmouth. I mean, Geoffrey of Monmouth is what I wrote my thesis on, and he is such a sort of like innovator for the Arthurian story. You don't have to read the whole history of the kings of Britain because there's quite a few kings. But the Arthurian story, as I say, it's Arthur's birth. You also got the story of Uther and Igraine in that one, and the sort of the generations, the sort of we were talking about earlier, the generations, so Uther to Arthur, and also I was just going to also kind of throw out, I suppose, a question about like how these games how you do with Mordred, because Mordred obviously has a real kind of familial connection to King Arthur in the legendary texts, but do you represent that in the games at all? That's kind of a sway away from the conversation, sorry, but I was really intrigued how you represent Mordred.
Yes, actually in Fall of Avalon there were several Mordreds, because Mordred is a hereditary title, just like most of the titles of Knights of the Round Table are in our game. So there is a question explored through Mordred. If, the treachery is baked into who he is baked into his very name, his very concept. So is someone who bears the title of Mordred predestined to betray, or is there any other way the story can go?
Okay, yeah, Mordred is sort of sometimes Arthur's nephew, sometimes Arthur's son. So that kind of generational conflict is a really intriguing one. Yeah.
Yeah, in our telling, we definitely went with T.H. White's version, I think, which is Mordred as Arthur's bastard child, who's this whining, sniveling kid who really wants to get everything but do nothing for it, because it really lent itself to the story that we wanted to tell. And he's just a great character to write as well, because everything he says is horrible.
Yeah, similar approach with Pendragon and the Great Pendragon campaign. It's the Mallory approach, but it's up to individual groups how they want to do it. Sometimes it can be like, well, Mordred's just a postmodern character in a medieval world, and he's just telling it like it is. He's not a jerk. He sees the hypocrisy of chivalry for what it is, And in other ones, he can be the sniveling, villain.
Yeah, and in our game, Moderator is basically your main hero. So he kind of starts as this edgy character, but you can shape his morality as you want. We have this complex morality chart in the game, so you can go to a rightful way, you can go a tyrannical way, and so on. So it's up to you, basically, how you shape him.
Well, I think that's all the time we really have to chat about this today, although links to anything more King Arthur we can find down below. I'd like to thank you all for coming to participate in this panel. I've had a wonderful time chatting about the myths and legends of the King Arthur, and I hope that you all have a wonderful day today, the rest of your evening or afternoon or whatever time it is for all of you.